Parliaments and presidents sitting on their pale hands while we say goodbye on dim screens 1,000,000 times. They think they can decide who is legal, who's a crime. They think they can decide who should live and who can die. 'Cause we work, we slave, while they eat their cake. A zero-sum made-up money game with a real body count.
Until we're all free, none of us is free. Until we build something, things stay broken. So
I would love to appreciate everyone who has attended this webinar, where we are looking forward to having conversations about COVID, HIV, and the operationalization of racial capitalism that has been taking place. I would love to introduce myself as Operatonalisation, an organizer on the global campaign against racism, and a moderator of today. Please allow me to give you a brief introduction or background, or take you retrospectively on how we come to this organizing today. As a global campaign against racism, we use critical consciousness as a tool that helps us to really organize and dive into colonial systems of governance at the global level, which has so much informed our actions, and much of which is organizing against vaccine imperialism. As a coalition, when COVID-19 started occurring, we realized that there is need to start a political education about the vaccine imperialism. And from there, we started building on to the actions that we can take against these systems of injustice. Our areas of interest were in really talking about the effects of this injustice to the communities. We were looking at building a Global South Coalition for Vaccine Equity. We were also considering that use an intersectionality approach where we have different disciplines playing a part in dismantling these systems of injustice surrounding access to vaccine. It did not only end with that. We also looked at using international legal platforms to see that we dismantle vaccine imperialism. We aspire to even go beyond vaccine imperialism, and by that, we have been able to organize debt cancellation. And with this, we project a picture of how debt affects the health of people. That came out of our partners that we are organizing with, asking out how we can project the racial capitalistic lens in the debt accumulation that is affecting so much of the global South. We call on people to join the platform on cancel the debt that we are organizing for Uganda and Malawi. And part of what informs why we are here today is World Trade Organization and its reaction to the TRIPS waiver. We all understand part of it is the three-paged letter. I would call it a three-paged letter because, I mean, it was playing ping pong, and the biggest population of the people who are asking for waiving of patency did not really get satisfied. So I would end there by calling some of our panelists to introduce themselves as we look forward to the next part of starting the conversations. Over to you, our panelists. Thank you.
I can start, Perut. I can at least introduce myself, and I see that our comrade Stella is here as well. My name is Maaza Siyum. I am with the People's Vaccine Alliance, which is a global coalition of about 100 organizations, activists, faith leaders, world leaders, so a global coalition that is dedicated to access to medicines, so vaccines, treatments, diagnostics, at the moment specifically focused on COVID-19. So we have been in place, actually started in 2020, before COVID vaccines were even available, started with an open letter that was sent to ministers of health from groups of activists and concerned citizens, advising the world not to make the same mistakes that were made on HIV with COVID. So this call was made before COVID-19 vaccines were even available, by people who had lived through the HIV epidemic and pandemic and remembered those days when those of us on the African continent did not have access to treatment when the rest of the world did. So it was a warning letter that started really the first efforts of the People's Vaccine Alliance. That warning, as we saw, was not heeded. And then in the time, the interim, more and more groups and individuals and leaders and activists joined the movement. So as I said, now we are a movement of about 100 organizations from around the world. My title is Global South Convener. So my role is to ensure that our members in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean are really fully integrated in terms of the strategizing, the planning, and making sure that the needs of those groups are fully amplified in the broader work of the coalition. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Perut.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Stella Namuganza. I'm from Uganda. I'm part of Equal Health. Part of C.A.R, Campaign Against Racism, and I'm part of the COVID-19 Vaccines Vaccines Coalition campaign. And professionally, I'm a nurse, I'm a midwife, but I'm also a clinical trialist. I have a special interest in products development, but also in access to developed products. And I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss where Uganda has come from in terms of access to the HIV drugs and the COVID-19 vaccines, and where we are and what we plan to do ahead. So yes, I'm happy to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panelists. How do we stand right now, and what do we envision as organizers? Could you give us some light about what we are envisioning now, and how are we standing?
Perut, I can make a short comment about that. And I know that we are hoping that our comrades from the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa will be with us as well for the panel. That's a group that is really so grounded in the struggle for HIV medication, both the struggle facing outwards to the global north, but also the struggle that they had to wage within South Africa to make sure that the South African government provided treatment for its citizens. I think, as I mentioned earlier, those of us who remember, we remember those days, and I know that, you, my comrades Stella and Perut from Uganda, and your extended families and friends also have experienced the loss of life due to HIV in those days when the global north was living with HIV as a chronic disease and had access to treatment. Those of us, from Africa, I am from Ethiopia myself, lost family members in that period when we did not have access. And I know that with the colleagues from the Campaign Against Racism and Equal Health, both of which are members of the People's Vaccine Alliance, we have often spoken with disgust about the US congressional hearing in the early 2000s when the director of the US Agency for International Development had the nerve to sit in public and say that there was no point in really rolling out HIV treatment on a wide-scale basis in Africa, because as Africans, we did not know how to tell time. We would not adhere to treatment, that the treatment would not work for us on our continent. And what we have seen since then, obviously, is some of the most successful and biggest HIV treatment programs in the world are on the African continent. So that's really kind of the history and the memory that we have, and the trauma that we feel when we see in the last year the same exact systems being used to make sure that our countries do not have access to COVID vaccines and testing and treatment. We've also seen a lot of the same tropes come back, issues about vaccine hesitancy. We've had pharmaceutical company CEOs, we've had people like Bill Gates come forward and say that Africans were hesitant around vaccines, and that's why the rollout has not been good. This during the period when the vaccines were being hoarded in the global north, and we had countries like Canada and the UK hoarding 5 times the number of vaccines that they would have been able to roll out in their countries. Then when it came time to try and roll out manufacturing, we heard the same messages, Africans are not going to be able to make these very complicated mRNA vaccines. The global south can't possibly handle this type of science and technology, even though the global south, India in particular, has been the pharmacy of the world for so many years. We see the mRNA hub in South Africa having to create an mRNA vaccine without any help from Moderna. And now we've seen with the so-called, I think you called it the 3-page letter, Perut, the so-called TRIPS waiver coming out of the World Trade Organization, that this whole situation continues. So when we get to a certain point in the panel, I'm happy to give a brief, update on how we got to the point where we are on the so-called TRIPS waiver, and what some of the activists in our network think about, the possible ways forward, just as initial brainstorming. But, in terms of where we come from, from the HIV struggle, this is really the fact that, as we talk about, racism, the fact that lives in the global south, Black lives, brown lives, were not valued back then, are still not valued now. We've heard so many misconceptions about the fact that COVID did not hit Africa very hard. What we know now is that it did hit the continent very hard, but the deaths were underestimated, because in a world where we have vaccine injustice, we also have diagnostics injustice, and the numbers were vastly undercounted. So we're in a situation again where, as we waited for this TRIPS waiver, millions of people died, while, lines of texts were being argued about. So that's, I think, the grounding. We come from a situation where millions of people died because they did not have access to HIV treatment. Now millions of people have died because they did not have access to vaccines. There was data that just came out in the lead up to the G7 meeting, which I think just finished. That's the group of 7, wealthiest so-called democracies, where they met recently, and the data that came out was that 600,000 lives could have been saved in low-income countries if vaccines had been rolled out as promised. So that I'll leave it at that for now, Perut. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. This is Stella. So I'll just give you a brief background about HIV and the struggle for, access to HIV drugs and vaccines for COVID in Uganda. So HIV in Uganda started in the early 1980s. And actually, people didn't understand the disease at first, but then later they thought it was related to witchcraft. Then in the mid-1980s, actually, the disease became very serious and many people died. Actually, Uganda had the highest prevalence of HIV in the whole world. It was about 30%, and we had the highest number of death rates from HIV in the whole world. Many people were orphaned, many people died. We lost labor, productivity plummeted. we, in a sense, like the economy went down. And remember that time we're just coming from the war and the country was just settling. Many people died. I remember losing relatives. I remember losing friends. I remember a family, our neighbors dying, like the whole family dead. It was a family of 8 people, but they all died, 6 children, mother and father. They died in a space of like 4 years. But during this time in 1994, actually, I think that was the first time ARVs were discovered in the USA. Up until 2000, actually, we still had not had access to these drugs. But it was very funny that we had the highest level of prevalence and death rates, but the drugs were not in Africa. But they were where actually the prevalence and death rates were lowest. So when they tried to engage the pharmaceutical companies and the US Congress, they were saying the reasons as to why we can't access the drugs in Africa is, one, because the sick people are too many, it's too hard for them to treat. But also, they were saying we lack the capacity to actually treat HIV and the infrastructure. So there is an when Uganda realized like HIV is actually real, they partnered with Case Western Reserve, and there is a clinical research institute called JCRC. They carried out a study to actually see if it is possible or feasible to carry out, to treat actually HIV in Uganda. And the results of the study actually showed that it is feasible to have treatment for HIV in Uganda. But because of politics, it was even hard. They made it hard to actually publish that paper, but it later was published. But because of the politics of pharmaceutical companies, they were saying you can't publish the paper, this thing is not feasible in Uganda and all that. So they tried to put them down. But up until I think around 2003, Uganda started to access actually the ARVs. And when we access the ARVs, surprisingly, the UNAIDS report in 2019 reported that the death rates had actually decreased by 55%, and the prevalence rates had decreased by 47%. You can imagine. So if this was done early, the number of people that would have been saved actually were many. And remember, when people were dying and labor was down and productivity was down, we got into those IMF loans again at the same time. So that the debt kept on being built because we had a debt. We had a big debt that we borrowed in the 80s, and it also affected us in a great way, and we're still struggling with those debts. So, and this did not only end there, it still manifested in the COVID-19. When COVID-19 came, we were forced to actually lock down our country and people weren't working. So when people stopped working, the economy went down again, and we borrowed a lot of money this time, and we're in debts, and it's affecting us up to today, actually. And so we still keep going in the same circles. And actually, when certain people started producing therapeutics in Africa, there was a gentleman who produced some drug called Covidex. He was defeated, he was demoralized, and people came up against him. He had lawsuits because he was trying to produce a drug to actually relieve symptoms for COVID-19. So we see a lot of politics playing, and then we still go back to the TRIPS article that was written. It's still wishy-washy and still saying the same things. You people can't manufacture drugs. You people can't do this. You people can't do that. So we keep going back to the same thing. And now I think later we want to reflect on what are we called to do in this situation? Because if we don't do something about it, another pandemic is going to come and still find us in the same place. So that's what I have to submit for now. And maybe I don't know, later. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our dear panelists. Tell us about your experience in the struggle for equity with regards to vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other health supplies. Most importantly, how does the racial capitalism manifest in your contexts?
Thank you, Perut. I mean, I think what I can say is just to highlight or to reiterate, what I had said earlier about the fact that in a world where we have, vaccine injustice, we also have diagnostics injustice. And when we have seen data from groups that have done modeling that compares excess deaths rather than just confirming the number of COVID deaths based on testing data, what we see is that for every life lost in a rich nation, another 4 people have died in a poor country. And people in poor nations are 1.3 times more likely to die as a result of COVID-19 compared to rich countries. And of course, we've also seen that the poorest people and people of color are more likely to bear the brunt of the pandemic. And that's the same whether it's in Brazil, where Black Brazilians are more likely to die of COVID than others, or in a country like the United States, where Black people and other people of color are more likely to die of COVID. I put a little, as part of the reading for some of the work that we've been doing, I discovered, and I was not familiar with the term necropolitics before last year, but really the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die, and really the right to expose other people to death. And that decision that either governments or pharmaceutical companies feel that they have, sometimes individually, sometimes working with each other, as we have seen, rich countries collaborating with pharmaceutical companies in the last year to basically decide who gets to live and who gets to die. I think some of us maybe hoped or assumed with these, social movements from the last, few years, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and elsewhere, that there was a different sort of appreciation, for racial equity. And what we have seen is that the systems of, racial capitalism, money when, pharmaceutical companies have been making $1,000 a second from these COVID-19 vaccines. So we're talking about Moderna, Pfizer, and BioNTech. The CEO of Moderna is now worth $6 billion. This is a company which makes hardly anything else. This was their first major product that they made with a huge influx of money from US taxpayers. They did not invest their own money in the development of this Moderna vaccine. So while they are making all this money, the value of Black lives and brown lives is really shown to be as worthless as it was 20 years ago. We thought that we had progressed since the time when the director of USAID sat there, and as Stella, mentions, as people were dying on a daily basis, here you have somebody in a position of power saying in 2002, so we're not talking about, in the early 1900s, quite recently, saying that Africans did not deserve access to treatment because we did not know how to tell time, and it wouldn't be worth wasting treatment on us. So it's just to, in terms of the racial capitalism, vaccine imperialism, and generally the sense of necropolitics and the lack of value on certain lives, that is something that has not changed. And just to echo what Stella is saying, and I think you mentioned as well, Perut, that we saw this with HIV, we're seeing it with COVID, we will see it again, unless we use the almost 20 million deaths from this pandemic as a catalyst to change things going forward. What this pandemic has done has exposed all the inequity that is right there, whether it's at country level or global level. And we really, I would encourage us all as campaigners and activists and fighters to think about how we can make sure that all the suffering, in addition to the deaths, we've also seen that 160 million people have been pushed into poverty, while the 10 richest men in the world have doubled their fortunes during this pandemic. So it's not only the deaths, it's also the morbidity, the sickness. We still don't know the weight of long COVID on our countries in the global South. What is that going to look like? The poverty, the gender-based violence, the other socioeconomic factors. How do we make sure that all this suffering for the last 2 years is actually turned into, a positive movement? Because yes, as you say, we've experienced this before, we're experiencing it now. We will experience it again if we don't really use all of this as a catalyst for change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Maza has said a lot, but for me, in particular, I think about the fact that these pharmaceutical governments and the global north governments actually play a lot around with time when we have pandemics actually. And in that time, we are actually losing people in the global south. And in that time, pharmaceutical companies are actually gaining a lot of profits while our people die. So when they've gained enough and they are tired, is when they think about, okay, let us now think of taking the drugs to Africa because we've made a lot of money and it's enough, and we can think about those people down that side. We saw this play out in the HIV pandemic, because remember the drug was discovered in 1994, but up until 2003, people were dying in Africa and they were buying time actually, I think, to make the most profits they would get out of the what? Out of the drug. Then they sent it to Africa later. And, you know, we clapped our hands because, I mean, anyways, there are those who survived at that time. But how about the many millions that died? That also has happened in COVID-19, actually. People keep wish-washing and walking around and doing what? Making meetings, while people in the global south die. And I don't know, I keep pinning WHO because we need to have some form of preparedness for all people if we believe that all lives matter actually, and that health is not a commodity just like the WHO seems to believe. Then we need to have a plan, otherwise we keep wasting a lot of time buying time until when they feel like maybe half of them have now died from the global south, and for them they have made maybe at least triple profits. Now that's when they make the decision. How come the decisions of treating people in the global north are made quickly and urgently, but getting drugs to the global south takes 7 years or even 8 or 9 years when people are actually dying and the emergencies are down this side? So that is how I see the racial capitalism playing out, them making profits. And then now after they are satisfied is when they think about giving us. It's like someone giving you their leftovers because now they are fully satisfied. And yes, we value it, but at what cost does it come when we've lost lives? So the time they take to respond to us really, really means a lot, and it costs lives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maza and Stella. That was so interesting. I mean, it relates so much to how Pfizer was making a post on how it's going to supply vaccines to Uganda. And I mean, I had to pose some bit of questions on whether that ain't pseudo generosity. About the donations, I mean, we've been getting expired donations even from Norway. That is very funny. It seems like this is a place where they are dumping anything that expired vaccines take to these countries, and we are like not humans, we are more of animals, but even animals cannot be subjected to expired vaccines. Not forgetting, we've been seeing a UNAIDS head Winnie Byanyima also talking about profitability, and I mean, I continue to encourage us to really pick an inspiration to make so much noise about racial capitalism as conversations that are still lacking in our settings.
Thank you, Perut. If it's helpful, I am not an intellectual property expert, but I am lucky that I have many colleagues who are. And if it's helpful, Perut, you think for the participants, I can go through a brief set of slides that one of my colleagues put together about how we got to the ministerial conference that happened at the World Trade Organization last week, and sort of some ideas of, the ways forward for us as activists in this post, TRIPS, so-called TRIPS waiver world. Would that be helpful?
Yes, I think maybe we can move to that and have some bit of discussion on that. That would be great.
Okay, let me see if I can share my slides. You'll let me know if you can see them. Can you see them, Perut? Are the slides visible?
Yes, they are. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, as we've talked about briefly, last week was the World Trade Organization's, I think it was about 10 days ago, the World Trade Organization's ministerial meeting wrapped up, where they really pushed through what they called a TRIPS waiver. And I was fortunate that just before this meeting, one of my colleagues wrapped up a set of slides trying to wrap up, where we came from and where we're going. So I'll go through those quickly because I think they're kind of an interesting grounding for people who might have heard a lot about the TRIPS waiver and are wondering what some of the initial brainstorming is about the way forward. So as I said earlier, the People's Vaccine Alliance first came together in May 2020. So this was before, the TRIPS waiver application had been put in by South Africa and India, before vaccines were even available. And Perut, you mentioned Winnie Byanyima, who is the head of UNAIDS. She was behind this first letter, along with colleagues from Oxfam, and she's currently the co-chair of the People's Vaccine Alliance. So I think that history of HIV treatment and the struggles for access really flow in very well, as we talk about this discussion of the struggle for COVID vaccines, treatments, and testing. So in terms of the timeline, just as a reminder to everybody, India and South Africa put in this TRIPS waiver proposal in October 2020. At that time, the official death toll from COVID was about 1 million people. Since then, the official death toll has hit 6.5 million. But as I said earlier, as we discussed, we know that in reality, the death toll is actually much higher. But even if we were just to look at this official death toll, while the pharmaceutical companies, while these rich governments were dragging their feet, that means that at least 5.5 million people died as we've been waiting for, for this TRIPS waiver. So that was, in October 2020, there was a counter proposal from the European Union. Then this MC12, the ministerial meeting, that's the ministers of trade, was postponed because of COVID. Some negotiations started, on text. And then finally in June, just last week or about 10 days ago, they reached a final outcome, which, as you say, Perut, is actually not a real, TRIPS waiver. And during this time, we can still say that to date, only 14% of people in low-income countries and 18% of people in Africa are fully vaccinated to date. The WHO, the World Health Organization, had a target that by mid-year, so by now, 70% of people in every country would have received at least one COVID-19 vaccine. So we're very, very far off from that as people have been dragging their feet. And as I said earlier, Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, the two companies that have been selling the very successful mRNA vaccines, are making a profit of $1,000 per second from these COVID-19 vaccines. Something else in the timeline important worth noting is that there is a clause that in December of this year, the World Trade Organization will decide on whether to extend this TRIPS waiver for diagnostics and therapeutics. At the moment, it does not include diagnostics and therapeutics, it's just for vaccines. So just to focus in a little bit on, the last few months, a lot has happened in the last few months leading up to this, June 17th final decision. We are quite disappointed, I would say, in the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi, who is a Nigerian who talks a lot about, how she's fighting for Africa. You'll see this cartoon here that one of our members from Dawn, Feminists for People's Vaccine, put together. Why this cartoon? Because there was actually a room in the World Trade Organization office called the Green Room, and a room where during this final negotiations, the World Trade Organization leadership decided who could enter the room and who was not allowed to enter the room in order to push for negotiations and to push for access for medications, treatments, and tools for their countries. So the UK, Switzerland, the EU were really the biggest blockers in terms of this TRIPS waiver negotiation. The US did say last year that they would support the TRIPS waiver for vaccines, but they said they would not be at the table if any discussions were pushed on diagnostics or treatments. And something that is quite interesting for all of us as we think about intersectionality is that the tobacco industry joined Big Pharma to lobby and to push against the TRIPS waiver. So that's the irony of that. You know, if you need anything to help you realize, you know, whether people have our best interests at heart or not, the tobacco industry joined Big Pharma to lobby against the TRIPS waiver. So in terms of the outcome itself, you know, as I said, I am not an intellectual property expert, but my colleagues who are have said that this is not a TRIPS waiver. I have one colleague who said it is hard to imagine anything with fewer benefits than this as a response to a global health emergency. Our statement, the People's Vaccine Alliance statement, which I will share around, also stated that this was not a TRIPS waiver. And basically, you know, the few things that it does is it gives a very narrow exception for compulsory licensing. It's only for vaccines, not for diagnostics or treatments, and in some ways actually makes things a little bit harder than the original TRIPS waiver. So they've added difficulties in the final agreement. Here just to say that pharmaceutical companies did express deep disappointment in the outcome, but at least they have finally accepted that intellectual property is a barrier. Initially, they had said intellectual property was not a barrier. Unfortunately, at the last minute, you know, the South African and Indian trade ministers changed their narratives a little bit. They were, to be fair to them, put under a lot of pressure by the World Trade Organization and Dr. Ngozi and the rest of the leadership there. And, you know, civil society really pushed for improvement, but in the end called for three main things. And I'll try to break them down as best as I can here, but civil society organizations called for the World Trade Organization and other trade and investment agreements, dispute mechanisms, you know, for people to pledge not to use those. And what does that mean? You know, I know that colleagues sat in Asia Russell's discussion with this group a few weeks ago. This is referring to compulsory licenses. A compulsory license is a non-voluntary interruption or breaking of patents, you know, triggered by a government. This is now, for example, the government of the Dominican Republic is trying to ensure that Paxlovid, a COVID-19 treatment, can be made in the Dominican Republic and has had to start a lawsuit with Pfizer to be able to do that. Pfizer is fighting the government of the Dominican Republic by saying that Pfizer itself, Pfizer's human rights are being trampled. So this is what Pfizer, the company, is saying, that its human rights as a company are being trampled by the Dominican Republic, trying to push through a compulsory license for the manufacturing of Paxlovid. So here, what, you know, Asia Russell had said and what the civil society organizations are asking for is that, for example, the government of the United States will declare that it will not retaliate against any country that might assert its sovereign rights to secure a compulsory license for some of these tools that we need for our countries. So that's point number one. Point number two is to take every step necessary using the very limited flexibilities that exist in the TRIPS waiver. There are a few, but countries will now need to put those into effect. So take all steps to put those into effect. And number three, break the rules when needed. And I think that's something that we've understood. You know, what colleagues who are experts in IP have said is that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has shown that it is not fit for purpose. We are following these global rules when these global rules have no interest in our lives. And so now we're encouraging people to, when necessary, break those rules, as South Africa did back in the day. And, you know, I know that Treatment Action Campaign comrades are not able to join us today, but, you know, they can tell us, they would have been able, and others can tell the story about how South Africa was actually in a lawsuit with about 30 pharmaceutical companies during that period of the HIV pandemic when South Africa did not have access to treatment. So in a lawsuit, this was at the time when Nelson Mandela was the darling of the world, you know, was in a lawsuit with about 30 pharmaceutical companies that were trying to prevent South Africa from being able to provide HIV treatment to its citizens. So if we need to break the rules, we should break them. Just some initial, very quick thoughts, in terms of what colleagues have brainstormed about, that civil society really came to the table, even though the outcome was not what we would have hoped. The fact that the world was talking about this TRIPS waiver and intellectual property, we can see that as, a win in some ways. Number two, we do, Perut, I mentioned this December 2022, that's when the World Trade Organization said we can revisit the inclusion of tests and treatment. This is something that we must fight for. The other important thing for all of us as campaigners is that the national contexts now become very important. There are these very narrow clauses within the TRIPS waiver, but countries would have to work on domestic regulations to allow for use of those flexibilities in the TRIPS waiver. So now that's kind of a country by country issue. As advocates in our own countries, we need to push our leadership to take advantage of these flexibilities. And then one of you, Perut or Stella, mentioned, the WHO and pandemic preparedness. There is a pandemic treaty being discussed right now at the World Health Organization. And it's something that we've heard talk about the fact that civil society has not been involved enough or has not been included in the discussions in a way that is acceptable. So civil society must be at the table in the discussions about this pandemic treaty. This is not just for COVID, this is for the future pandemics that we still have yet to even begin to understand. Finally, and this is something, Tinashe and Anne-Marie and Perut, as you think about, future kind of political education, there has been quite a bit of talk about the free trade agreements between the European Union and India and Indonesia, that these can have lasting effects and can be really detrimental even more detrimental than what was agreed on at the World Trade Organization. I would encourage all of us to reach out to the Third World Network. They're really the ones who actually pushed very hard for some of the text in the TRIPS waiver to not be as bad as it could have been. And they're also the ones that have been raising these issues about the free trade agreements to all of our groups. So I would really encourage us to reach out to them and have them educate us on this. And also, Stella, for you as somebody who works, in new product development, there's been quite a bit of talk about regulatory pathways, at WHO at international level for new products. So how do we make sure that when new products come out and they go through regulatory processes, it's done in a way that allows for good access? Finally, and this, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know that we are going to discuss further, but just some brainstorming on campaign opportunities. As I've already said, inclusion of tests and treatment in the World Trade Organization sort of next discussions in December. Something that is really exciting is that there's these compulsory licensing fights in Latin America and the Caribbean. I mentioned the Dominican Republic is right now in a lawsuit with Pfizer. There are similar compulsory licensing fights in Peru, in Chile, and Colombia. So we really need to support our colleagues in Latin America as they push those forward. And again, another point for you, Perut, and colleagues at Campaign Against Racism, maybe invite them to come and teach the rest of us, what are lessons learned from their lawsuits and struggles in their countries, pushing for intellectual property reforms within countries. And then really the sharing of technology is something that we have to keep on pushing for. Stella, you mentioned Pfizer and what they're doing across Africa at the moment. They have these very half measures, in some countries, including in Rwanda, they put forward what they're calling biontainers. This is Pfizer, BioNTech has these containers that they have sent around Africa, not even a building, these containers that they've shipped to various African countries so Africans can fill and finish the vials that are produced in Europe. So again, it's this, we're giving you a little crumb, we'll give you the crumb and we'll make everybody think that this is something really big that we're doing. They do have some African leaders on side with them on this. We believe at the People's Vaccine Alliance that this is really a half measure. This is not the real deal. This is not manufacturing at local level. This is really a half measure. Africa still imports 99% of its vaccines that Africa uses. That is a situation that is not sustainable for the long term. And then also on pharma greed more generally, you know, right now, pharmaceutical companies are saying that, oh, there's no problem anymore with vaccines. You know, it's really more that the infrastructure is not good. You know, the supply is fine. Africans are vaccine hesitant. As we speak, there are new generation vaccines that are being, the pan variant vaccines should be ready by September or October. And already we're seeing that most of those have been bought up by rich countries. So the same thing that we saw just last year with the first generation vaccines, we're already seeing happening again with the second generation vaccines. So that's something that we really have to keep an eye on. And when they say that the supply is fine, there are no longer any supply problems. They are, and as you say, Perut, you know, they're talking about the vaccines that they send to Africa 2 weeks before they expire. They know that even in New York City, they would not be able to roll out vaccines within a 2-week notice, you know, let alone large countries that have vast, you know, spaces of land, you know, to get through to deliver. We are seeing, so they're talking about the supply being fine now, but there is also the new vaccines that are coming out and that we're seeing the same hoarding happening with those. So I'm sorry to go through that relatively quickly. I hope that was helpful. That's just sort of a brief roundup of where we were, where we are now, and some initial brainstorming on the ways forward. Tinashe and Anne-Marie are members of the People's Vaccine Alliance with Campaign Against Racism, and I hope that we can keep talking about these and get some national level campaigning and advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maza. That was very interesting. Maza, maybe you could help us throw some bit of highlight on how do you think we can engage governments at the national level? Also, maybe another question would be, how can we see that we also contribute to the negotiations that are ongoing about pandemic prevention, preparedness and response that is ongoing, which you said civil society hasn't engaged in so much. So as a campaign against racism, I mean, we always front our racial capitalistic lens and can see to it that it justifies the actions that are being, the negotiations that are taking place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I can see that our comrade Joy Burungi's chiming in here, and I'd be curious to hear if the other attendees have ideas. I know that in South Africa and in India, because South Africa and India were the ones who had put in, you know, the TRIPS waiver application, civil society in those countries are now ready and are already lobbying, you know, for example, the South African government to put into effect, you know, the national laws that need to be put in place in order to take advantage of the flexibilities. So I would say, I would really encourage us, you know, some of us have civil society groups in our countries that we know are comfortable with pushing government. Maybe somebody, a civil society representative, sits on a ministerial advisory council, you know, in Uganda, a civil society group, you know, who interacts with, you know, the Ministry of Trade for some, you know, for some project. So I would encourage us to go through our civil society networks and find out who are the groups that are somehow involved with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Trade, and really make sure that, you know, when these discussions take place, civil society is at the table. I would encourage us, as I said, to invite a group like the Third World Network, that if we need capacity building on this, can really help us, you know, because sometimes even if you were given a seat at a ministerial advisory council, you think to yourself, what am I going to say when I get there? I don't want to get there and show that I don't, you know my subject very well. So I'd be happy to, you know, they are members of the People's Vaccine Alliance, and I can, you know, link them up with you all, and maybe they could do a political, you know, an education session here. I think that would be very useful. In terms of the WHO pandemic treaty, I do have a website link that has a section on the bottom that says, you know, I think it says something like, you know, join here in order to, I think they're having like Zoom webinars and other ways which are not ideal, obviously, Perut, like in terms of, you know, like internet access, and how do you make sure that you can really get your feedback in. But I think we have to do our best to make sure that we integrate ourselves into those discussions. I'm sure there will be hybrid meetings and maybe in-person meetings before they finalize the pandemic treaty. So I'll put that link in the chat now.
Thank you very much, Baza. So to Stella, what does the campaign against racism envision? What are some of the actions that have been put in place to see that we dismantle or take action on the vaccine imperialism and beyond even vaccine imperialism?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the campaign against racism has formed a subgroup called Cancel the Debt, actually, and Cancel the Debt basically is building tactics around canceling the debt for Malawi and Uganda. And they do this through different tactics. They're building, creating awareness actually on the debt, the IMF debt for the populations in order for them to understand and take part in these conversations. Because, you know, in Uganda in particular, actually even in Malawi, many people don't even understand anything about that IMF debts. Why are we here? Why are we in poverty? Why are people dying? Why can't we access the medications? But we are trying to create awareness, and this will raise the critical consciousness of people, but not only just the population, but even leaders, because most of the conversations on television and wherever they are do not actually go deep. They are not high level conversation. They concentrate downstream, and therefore the masses and populations actually do not know the reasons as to why we are where we are, as to why you can't access drugs, as to why people are dying. So we are trying to organize and create awareness as Cancel the Debt to the population so that we can rise and inform governments and push governments to also push the IMF so that we can achieve balance somewhere. The other thing, the other strategy that we are taking is to connect with other bigger struggles, like working with they are working with the movement law labs. Yes, and so this will actually add synergy to them in pushing for this Cancel the Debt. We also want to change the narrative of media platforms, because usually, like I said before, the conversations that people engage you in as citizens, if they are low-level conversations, if they don't bring out the real heart of why things are happening in the country, media just speaks around snippets of what is happening, and the masses are not informed. So we want to change their narrative to get them to do the real analysis of the problems that we are facing in the country, so that we can actually solve the actual problems which are related to that debt. But we shall also go through legal litigations and petitions in order to cancel this debt or reduce those fines that they were giving us for the late payments and all that. So basically, that is what the campaign against racism is doing at the moment. Thank you very much, Peru. You can add on more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stella. I'm glad to say I'm part of the coalition that is organizing against around debt cancellation. And we still would love to have a good number of people really join us in building power. In case you are interested, we email us on campaignagainstracism@ecohealth.org. Moving forward, I have some questions for the panelists, as our attendees are able to think of the questions that we would want to be asking the panel. How important is it to intersect the struggle to dismantle vaccine imperialism with other struggles on racial capitalism? Are you seeing this happen? And can you give us some examples?
I mean, I can start just to say, Perut, that the fact that the UN, the committee against and Marie, remind me of the group that wrote the letter at the UN. The UN, the fact that at the UN we are now discussing, the term, it used to be that even just 10 years ago, if you said that a system was racist at the UN level, people, and particularly white people, would rise up and complain and say, are you accusing me of being racist? And then you have to, spend an hour trying to make sure that their feelings were not hurt. Yes, the Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So the fact that even there is a discussion about the fact that, vaccine rollout for this COVID-19 pandemic has been done in a racist way. I think that's already, we've made progress in a small, that hasn't solved our issue, but the fact that that is being recognized, I think we're already, moving in the right direction. I think that the education that you all are doing, yes, and thank you for sharing. There's an article here, yes, the vaccine inequality due to racism rooted in slavery and colonialism. So, and I think the education that all of you all do, the fact that you ensure that translations are provided, there was somebody who attended one of our People's Vaccine Alliance meetings last week and said, there was no revolution without translation. If people could not be at the table and express themselves and ask questions, there's no way that the change will happen. So I think this is kind of continued education that is essential, and also making sure that we recognize when we need additional support, to be able to understand a complicated topic, and recognizing that within our groups, when we try and address something as complicated as, racial capitalism, that within our groups, there are members that have expertise in the different areas of intersectionality, so we can bring somebody who's an expert on, cancel the debt. We can bring somebody who's an expert on IP, and this is one thing that, as much as it's been challenging to have all the meetings this way on Zoom, what it does do is that it allows all of us from around the world to be able to speak to each other. I think those of us with my Ethiopian passport, it takes, I think sometimes it would be easier to be prime minister of some of these countries than to even get a visa to travel to them. The amount of, when people would try and invite you to a conference or a meeting and you would just say, my gosh, will I even be able to get a visa to go to that place, But now, because the meetings are hybrid, we can do them in this way and really bring the voices and call people out when necessary. So Perut, I don't know if that answers your question. I think the progress is very, very slow, but the fact that we are recognizing that these issues need to be called out, and the fact that we can speak directly about racism now without having to go through a 30-minute, discussion to make sure that, one white guy's feelings were not hurt in the meeting. That's something that happens, I think, a little bit less now than it used to even 5 years ago.
Okay, so basically for me, from my experience and what I understand, I feel like the foundation for vaccine inequity actually is majorly rooted on racism and in racism actually. Because yes, I have seen inequities in other forms, but the major one has been between the global north and the global south, between the black and the white race. That is where we see the biggest gap. So there's something right around there that we need to recognize. There's a problem around there. And that calls for us to actually collaborate, the people who are working on racism and the people who are working on vaccines equity. It calls for them to work together because there is a multifaceted layer of problems there that we need to work together on. Much as, yes, even among the white people country, there is, poor distribution of vaccines, or maybe poor access to vaccines. Maybe there is inequity in access to vaccines between maybe the rich and the middle class and what, but it's not as big. The gap is not as big as it is for the global north and the global south, for the black people and the white people. The gap is really so wide. So yes, there is need for them for the two parties to collaborate, because that those layers of problems need to be uncovered, and we understand the real actual problems, and then we come up with interventions that will actually help. Otherwise, if we all work alone, we may not know where the problem intersects, and therefore we may not solve the actual problem. So I think it is very important and necessary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maza and Stella. I'm already seeing some questions flowing in. Maybe just to make some bit of a submission on what you said. In addition to what you said, we can look into the interdisciplinary approach, like Stella gave a hint. Bringing conversations of economics and how the economics affects the health. I mean, we are talking about the debt, but then as health professionals, as organizers, sometimes we shun away from the conversations pertaining economics. And we've had a question from, is it Anjali? And she says that I often see that the blame for deaths in the Global South is imposed upon the governments of the Global South instead of Western, which makes it hard to enact policy change. Could you think about the role of media and reporting from Western areas in bringing about the change?
Okay.
First of all, like we had said, like I'd said before, this problem of inequality in access to COVID and the deaths of people is multifaceted. And yes, the Global South governments have done a few things. They've made a few mistakes that maybe have led to death of people. But where does the problem come from if you're going to do a root cause analysis? If we go back to root cause analysis, the problems could actually be coming from the north. But it's also important in any conflict, or if there is any problem, to know who governs the media and what kind of reports they are making. And I'm liking that you're bringing that up right now, because that is a way of the global north, you know, protecting themselves or covering themselves like they always do, telling people that Africans don't know how to read time, so we can't give them medications. There are things that have happened in Africa, yes, we agree, but where do those mistakes that are done by leaders from Africa come from? Who guides, who leads those African leaders into making these mistakes? For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were put on pressure to have a lockdown. People could not access resources. There are people who died from COVID, but there are people who died from the policies that were put in place, and governments were put on pressure by the Global North government. Yes, thank you very much, Stella. I don't know, Maza, if you have anything to add on to that.
Yes, I would just say that I think this is, you know, to Anjali's point, this is something that is still very frustrating in terms of the media narrative. But I would say that that's an area where I think we have also improved a tiny bit, you know, where now I see Western media outlets at least making an effort to reach spokespeople and actual representatives on the ground, you know, so it's not always, you know, so-and-so in Brussels because, you know, he's an Africa expert speaking about, you know, the entire continent. So there's a little bit better, I think, with communication being a little bit easier, being able to reach people on WhatsApp and having, you know, experts in all of our countries available to answer questions. That's something that has, you know, improved on a very practical level. You know, I know what the People's Vaccine Alliance has done is really to try and have, you know, media contacts available around the Global South. So if, you know, Reuters or the Washington Post, or somebody has a question that they want to ask about an issue of, vaccine inequity or vaccine access, that they can have a conversation with a person on the ground, and they're not just talking to, a representative, as I said, in Brussels or Geneva or Washington, DC, or something like that. So it takes a little bit of time, but, on a practical basis, that does help. I would say as well that, we do need to continue holding our own leaders to account as well. When I hear the stories of, certain African governments touting what I mentioned earlier, the BioNTainer, these, containers as being a solution to vaccine inequity for the continent, I find it quite frustrating, because I feel that we're, agreeing to a half measure, when really we should be supporting things like the World Health Organization's mRNA hub and training program to make sure that groups around the continent we need to be able to make our own vaccines, whether it's for this pandemic or the next one, So I think we need to hold our leaders to account. Asia Russell from HealthCap, when she spoke to this group a few weeks ago, and was saying that we would need to push the US to not enforce rules against these compulsory licenses. She was also saying that we at our level would need to pressure our own governments as well to kind of be stronger about that, not to hide behind the US and say, we don't want to do this because we're worried about the US. What we know is that Pfizer is also very busy, in all of these countries. There's a US Africa Business Summit taking place in Morocco next month. And who is one of the lead sponsors is Pfizer. So, they are very busy, they know that there's money. They are making so much money off of these products. If there is ever an HIV vaccine, it will probably be on an mRNA platform. They're already counting, that money that they'll be, those private islands that they'll be buying, those jets that they'll be flying on. So I think we also need to recognize that our leaders, if they're schmoozing with the head of Pfizer at the US Africa Business Summit, it's partially for this reason, to be able to make these half deals and say that they are successful deals. So I think we do need to hold our own leaders to account as well. But on the media side, Anjali, I think we have improved a little bit, and we still need to do the practical work to make sure that that continues to improve.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maza. We will have two more questions. Maybe we just give some bit of a brief response on a question that Bariayaka Shira presented on why tobacco would oppose the TRIPS. I mean, it's very perplexing to see tobacco getting involved. Is it about the negative solidarity? I mean, it's very perplexing. And then maybe we can move on to the next question.
So I put the article in the chat here. So there's an article that I put in the chat. Big Tobacco is funding opposition to global COVID vaccine access. And there's a quote from one of the civil society groups that, that said, the tobacco industry has historically attempted to use IP rules to block meaningful tobacco control measures in countries around the world. And she says, I assume that's why they want to continue upholding those rules. And obviously, they don't care about our lives. So anything they can do to continue that hold on IP. But the article is quite short, and it's worth a read for the person who asked the question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. One very last question is for people who are feeling hopeless after the World Trade Organization, since it was such a crucial objective to have a TRIPS waiver on vaccines and treatments, what would you say about them, and how do we remain hopeful and reimagine vaccine equity? I'm very certain we're all down. Yeah, it was quite a disappointment. How do we build hope?
I think from my end, I feel hopeful when I see the comrades in the Dominican Republic and Peru and Chile fighting these compulsory license battles with a company like Pfizer, who has the nerve to say that Pfizer said that their human rights were being infringed, Perut. I mean, it's just like they have no, and I know it's difficult to shame the shameless, but we keep trying, but they are completely shameless. but people are out there fighting on a daily basis, to push through these compulsory licenses for treatment. I also feel hope when I see the scientists around the world that are getting bits and pieces of information and making, their own mRNA vaccines. And I think all of us here, together continuing to learn, trying to learn new things all the time. I know very little about intellectual property, but now I'm trying to, pick up bits and pieces. So that's really, where the hope comes from. So that's from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, I also think knowing that we are here for that purpose and knowing what South Africa went through and Africa, but they got on top of it at the end of the day, I really think it should be one of the things that should give us hope, but also being here today and being part of these conversations actually should be one thing that should give us hope. Sometimes some things can be handled by defying. And yes, if it means defying, we shall, like the way South Africa did at the end of the day. They had lawsuits, but they succeeded. So I think there is hope, and that is why we are here today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stella. Oh, okay, thank you very much, Stella, about what you've said, and Maza, about what you've just shared. Just to say, I was also intrigued about what happened in the TRIPS waiver, and I struggle every day to see that I understand patency and what was entailed in the patency. And it's something I would also encourage my friends on the campaign to really dive much into. I don't know if our panelists or any of us has anything to share before we close. So excellent. If we have, if we are all satisfied that we're moving out of this conversation with the power and strength to go and rebuild much about vaccine imperialism, dismantle it from all perspectives, I would be very appreciative. I would love to thank everyone who took their time to join us on these conversations. I would love to appreciate the organizers who took their time to organize this session, and to our panelists, our beloved panelists who have really taken time to give so much insight about so many things that we are moving away with, and believing that we can now also get onto different platforms to, speak about the same things. And to our dear interpreters, you have really done a great job. There's not much to share. And for that, I would say happy Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Perut. Thank you, everyone.
Build something, things stay broken. So we